Welcome to our last session of the day. As Lucy said, I'm Keisha Punchy-Haver. I'm Deputy GC at the SRA, and I'm chairing the session. In our December 2024 report on risk in the legal profession, we surveyed 515 solicitors, and that included 102 in-house solicitors, to look at what the profession thinks are the major opportunities and risks that it currently faces. Perceptions, as you would imagine, varied with solicitor type, but the message we heard from the in-house community we surveyed was that they are more likely to see law tech and AI as a space where there's great opportunity as well as challenge. Dedicated AI for legal work was once only accessible for the largest of firms, but that's no longer the case. There's an increasing range of commercial products, making it easier for small firms to benefit, and several systems are available online for anyone to use. The cost and speed benefits that these systems bring could be a major advantage for businesses who adopt them. And consumers, our clients, are really technically savvy and potentially know a little bit more than us about the tools and what tools could do for us. So AI can play a really important role in supporting solicitors to do their job in a more efficient way. It's taking away manual, repetitive tasks that can take up a disproportionate part of our day. And I'm really interested to discuss this with the panel today. There's real scope for it to do much, much more. It's likely that it might be practice area specific, but again, interested to see what our panel have to say. So what we want to do today is talk about the opportunities that AI presents for us as in-house solicitors, and if we have time, for what the future holds. As with the other sessions, there's going to be an opportunity for questions. I would say please ask any questions. I put myself in the category of really don't understand the terminology and properly what AI can do for you. So partially for me, and I wondered whether there were other people in the audience that might benefit from this, we want to do a sort of a scene setting piece at the beginning so that, and our panelists can talk a little bit about sort of some of the terminology, you know, what AI can do, etc. So Harry, if we could go to you first, please, to kick us off on that scene setting piece.
No pressure.
No. What is AI, Harry?
When we were discussing this previously, I think we discussed absolutely no presumed knowledge. At the simplest level, AI has been around for a very, very long time. I was very fortunate to be in an AI-driven company for a long time before ChatGPT came out. At the time, it was often referred to as algorithmic tech. It was all very different. But if you've ever had a pushed advert on your phone, that is a form of AI, and that's been around since the early 2000s, right? And that's just one form. The big shift is now the accessibility of AI. The zeitgeist has really changed. And ChatGPT, the late 2021 moment, has really changed the dynamic. Before I go into a little bit about the different types of AI, just to show you the type of explosion, particularly within the in-house scene. The company I work for, I'm the GC there, but they sell primarily to lawyers. They were growing at 10 to 15% a year for years. 2020 comes around, 2021, and we've grown at several 100% a year every year. It's been an absolute rocket ship, but almost all of that has been on in-house teams, and a tiny amount has been on private practice. In the last year, that's really shifted. And the reason for that is the amount of in-house teams asking their external counsel why they are not using the same pieces of technology that they are seeing advantages with. Not just the company I work at, but as you say, there's a huge variety of technology out there for different use cases and different practice areas. Broadly, AI, as we can understand it at the simplest level, is split into three sort of domains. You've got something that most lawyers will be pretty familiar with, your sort of research tool AI, asking questions from a defined data set and giving a conceptual answer. So anyone who's used like a PLC co-counsel or Lexis, any of those things, but basically taking natural language and condensing the huge data set into a particular answer to answer a conceptual question. There's also what I would consider analytical AI, which is basically where you've got a defined data set to extract more nuanced questions from, so a contractual data set, a repository of specific data to your sector, your company, whatever it may be. Now, the nuance between and overlap between those two things is they can connect or they can be standalone, right? So if you have a contractual repository, extracting defined information just from that with no external information can be very useful. It may be more useful to bring in external information to contextualize that. The final and more recent, that technology, both of those have been around for forever, basically, to some form or another. All they have function on is essentially attaching a numerical value to a word. That's all AI has been for most of its history in terms of useful outcomes for people, i.e. this word, we attach this number, that word, we attach this number. Together, we're tagging another number. Now that other number is the context, right? So now whenever we see those two numbers together, we know this other number is the context, and therefore you can translate that into a contextual understanding. Hopefully that sort of made sense. We can go into that. Anyway, that's basically how AI worked for a long time. The big difference is in 2017, Google created something called Transformer. We're not going to get into that, but you could essentially have predictive AI. So AI just became far, far more efficient at predicting what the next word, the next image, the next sound would be from a very, very large data set. And when people say, oh, AI is getting better and better, what they actually mean is the ability for it to understand a huge amount of context and distill that into a predictive answer, i.e. we think that if you say you want us to generate an image of a solicitor tap dancing, here's a good output, and the quality of understanding and refinement has continuously improved. So most of the time when we talk about generative AI, it's really a form of predictive AI. I am expecting an outcome and it is being delivered. The biggest development in the last 2 years, and you'll hear a lot of this terminology in the next 2 to 3 years to come, is agentic AI. Agents basically are just autonomous sequences by which if I am a person and I know that if a legal ticket comes into my whatever my team management system is, my inbox, whatever it might be, that the next thing I'm going to want to do is research the answer. Then I'm going to want to consolidate that into an email. I'm going to want to have the context of who the reply is to, all that kind of information, and prepare the draft, right? An agent basically goes through all those steps rather than, as most lawyers have, I think, typically thought of AI in the last 3 to 4 years, just accelerating standalone tasks, right? That is the big shift that is happening, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that next few years, and deployment in in-house teams is already massively accelerated compared to private practice. Sorry, I went on for a bit.
No, that's really interesting. And Wendy, I know that you have a really interesting perspective on it from a science and tech and having been an in-house lawyer point of view. So I wonder if you could talk to that question too.
Sure. I was slightly nervous to say I was a lawyer and then a CEO after Jim's comment about psychopath. Maybe the behavioural science moderates that, but so that is my background, but I went into a fintech startup, so without the tech knowledge. And technology, these technologies have been around for decades, and the latest thing is always called AI, and then when it becomes the second latest thing, it's just technology, which is one way of looking at it as well. But it is different versions, and this latest version of Gen AI that has grabbed everyone is because it works on Word, which is the coin of the realm for lawyers, isn't it? And we can all interact with it in a new way. In financial services, it was very much looking at data sources and what can you do with them and what do they mean. And you'd have rules-based that could generate certain types of alerts, for example, but what data could you represent on a screen to make a story of what was going on? And we were working with compliance officers to try and spot things like market abuse, insider trading. What data would tell you whether or not somebody was doing that? And as Harry's already said, there's different formulations of AI that can work on data that you've got and generate the information that you need when you're looking at it. I think the challenges is understanding what behaviours that data represents. And this morning has been so fascinating because it's all been about behaviour. And that was the reason that I left law, in fact, was to go and study behaviour, because working in-house, giving advice, it was all about decisions and judgment, and watching how people took those decisions was really interesting, and I wanted to go and study it. There's a whole field of behavioural science on judgment and decision making. There's a whole field of behavioural science on systems engineering, which we were hearing earlier, is actually how do people in complex organisations interact with each other. So trying to understand what's the right data, what's the limits of this technology actually is really important. And that was something as pre-Gen AI, as I was in NASDAQ, and all of the leaders of the banks were saying, we need AI. Everyone's talking about AI, we need AI. Why can't we have AI to generate these alerts? We had really great, highly accurate, rules-based alert generation that the regulators loved because you could explain exactly how the rule worked. AI, not very explainable. The latest, the kind of neural net type analysis, not explainable. Can you really prove you've analysed all of the behaviour that you're looking at? And also what we found was, when you speak to experienced compliance officers to understand the behaviour they were looking for 20 different elements represented by data that wasn't available to the AI algorithm. And we found that through behavioural science interviewing of those people. Now, that's really important to understand where the edges of these technologies are. And with Gen AI, I think because they're so consumable, they look so good, it's really important for us to understand right now, where are the edges? Where's the unintended consequences of it? There's a really interesting Microsoft research just done on critical thinking and the impact of using Gen AI. And it's different depending whether you're an experienced person. Actually, if you have high confidence in your own ability, slightly less confidence in the technology, your critical thinking of what gets produced is higher. You still find it easy to use, but you're much better at critically analysing what is in front of you. Whereas junior people actually much higher confidence in the tech, lower confidence in themselves, much lower critical analysis of it. And that's problematic if actually what we've got to try and improve as well is critical thinking of juniors going forward. So for me, it's all about, yes, you need to understand a bit about how this works, but particularly where are the edges, where are the limitations of it? And that's where I think we're at the bleeding edge of that at the moment.
And Aisling, is there anything from an SRA perspective that you'd like to add here?
I think both Harry and Wendy have given much better explanations of AI than I would be capable of offering. I would say the shift that I've noticed, both kind of from working generally in the justice system and in legal services regulation for a number of years now, is that the conversation is very much shifted from why. Why would I use AI or tech generally to how? And I think we kind of saw that certainly kind of at the onset of COVID and kind of big shifts in remote working. But I think the opportunity for tech and now for AI is very much kind of recognised, and people do want to use it. They want to use it safely and kind of responsibly. I think kind of more broadly from an SRA perspective, we obviously kind of regulate a broad church, and we very much, I suppose, kind of the challenges and the questions that we get now are less about kind of, I suppose, the lack of availability of tools, and it's more of that question of how do I navigate this kind of market and landscape and just even kind of compare providers. And exactly as kind of Wendy said, I think we're at very much this bleeding edge of people wanting to do it and wanting to kind of do it ethically and in a responsible way, and being excited about the potential of AI, but wanting more help to do it, I would say.
Lovely, thank you. And then, Harry, I'm going to come to you. So talking about sort of the practicalities in your day-to-day life, working for a company that sort of produces and you use the AI that your company produces, sort of what benefits does it bring to you and to your team?
Well, I think the main thing to zoom out on is that we don't just use the one product that we make. We use a bunch of AI products. We're an AI-forward company, so you wouldn't be surprised to hear we're evangelical about AI. But part of my job from a GC perspective, also managing the risk of that. So having clear processes in place, having the hard lines as to what we won't do, where we won't host. So for example, we're very worried about intellectual property. We never host data in China. Right, very simple, practical points. The practical day-to-day would depend very much on the size of organization and the practice area. What BAE might find useful is very different than what a two-person legal team in a scale-up might find. Now, the greatest advantage I find about and lots of knowledge systems, using that term broadly, have been helpful for this over time, but AI is generative AI in particular has been very useful for is, especially if there's a way of training repeatable outcomes, is institutionalizing knowledge. So as you scale a business, as you scale an organization, having consistency of approach, not losing institutional knowledge and growing a team, that's not just within legal, that's broader. So for example, legal being the guardrail in in-house teams of RFPs that your business is participating in, all that kind of stuff is incredibly valuable to a business and is business enabling. You know, we often talk about in-house teams should be business enablers and not commercial blockers. Well, that's a tangible example, is how can we get them from RFP receipt to RFP out as fast as possible, and there shouldn't be a legal queue. If we can automate a lot of those answers, flag which ones are the highest risk that need secondary review, and the rest we're happy to generate from repository, really practical. Now, some of the most valuable use cases are the simplest. So, you know, automated note-taking, incredibly helpful for Zoom calls, right? Really, really helpful. Board meeting minutes, really, really useful. But I don't want to have to spend the 3 hours after board meeting going through it. I'd rather review a first draft, right? Now, it could be that I want to bring in a junior lawyer into the room to do that as well, but that's not always available, especially if it's last minute or particularly discreet. The challenges practically are most lawyers in-house, and I suppose somewhat externally as well, are fighting two battles. One is, what can we use tools to make our own practice more efficient, and what are the tools and practices that the wider business wants to use that we need to understand and guardrail. And the second one is more complex because we tend to think very clearly about what our own needs to do our job better is, but having a deep understanding of the rationales and the day-to-days of every role in the business is really important. And I think in the last panel, there was a discussion about, you know, what the stated ethics of the business are and what the real practical ethics of a business are. And it's the same with what the commercial reality is. You know, there was not to throw Womble Bond under the bus too much, but, you know, there was a lot of press recently about sort of unsanctioned AI use. And I was very disappointed to see that the response was to shut things down rather than say, well, a huge amount of our staff see value in something, and instead of saying, how can we guardrail that and enable it to deliver better customer service and a better quality of work-life balance or whatever it may be, it was to close it down. And that's not how most businesses operate. That's how businesses fail, because they see a commercial advantage. They want to try and exploit it as reasonably as possible. And I think lawyers in-house are increasingly under pressure to understand the technologies that their wider business stakeholders are using in order to maximize them safely.
And can I ask Wendy the same question of you?
Yeah, I mean, for our small business, actually, the ability to use Gen AI to bulk up the tech team is phenomenal. Actually, to create tech with somebody who's experienced, knows how to use it, is incredibly helpful. So we do use the tools that are out there for that sort of purpose. But actually, what's really interesting is there's a new culture of shadow IT emerging, that people are using tech because, you know, going to that point earlier about ethics and what really happens in organizations, you know, why do good people do bad things? It's usually because they're trying to get a good job done and their tools around them aren't very easy to use, or, you know, things are getting in the way and they're under pressure to get it done. So people start going, oh, well, I'll just use it on my personal laptop and I'm at home and nobody can see that and I'm getting a great job. And that's the key challenge, isn't it? It's really understanding how people work. And that's really what we're looking at, is understanding how people really work in their organizations. And I think there are huge opportunities in the low-hanging fruit of getting the ability to automate lots of tasks that get done repetitively. And if you're freeing up all of that time, then that's the piece that we're starting to look at. It's, well, what happens if you've taken away some of the stuff you might have learnt on to get to do higher value work? How do you do higher value work when you've never seen it done before? And I thought it was a great example earlier from Luke, talking about how he helps the junior lawyer come up to speed. If you've not seen it, and in this hybrid working environment, how do you get that understanding of real work? How do you know when to have that conversation with a client when they're brainstorming and you don't want to pull them down? When's the right moment to bring it in? And how do you know that? And that comes from years of experience and exposure. And what we're looking at is, can we capture some of that know-how, which we call know what, when, why, who, how, by using this tech to actually have conversations with those experienced people, to talk about what they know and how they know it and when they know it and why they know it, where do they get it from, in a way that you can capture, because there's something like 90% of what we have in our heads never gets written down. And I think you know that when somebody leaves your organisation, you say, goodness, that's how much knowledge is walking out the door. And what we know from behavioural science methodology, and we've used it in order to understand and design tech for complex jobs, is there's ways to get that information out of people's heads. And the latest Gen AI is what we're using to train to try to pull out some of that experiential know-how so you can make it more available to other people in your team and more junior people. Because psychological safety is a real thing. I mean, in the legal profession, you're smart people and you're paid to know. So it's really difficult to ask those stupid questions. It's quite difficult to go and ask a really busy person, and it's even more difficult when they're not sat next to you anymore, and you can just go, I just heard you say such and such. So actually, if you can start to design tech that allows people to tap into other people's thinking in a more interesting way, I think there's huge potential in that kind of capability.
And what I want to explore next, Ash, and I'll come to you first, please, is what sort of things are you hearing from people coming to the SRA in terms of sort of, how do all lawyers, and particularly with a focus on in-house lawyers, how do they navigate the question potentially with their organisation if their organisation is not as forward-thinking in terms of embracing AI, and sort of the risks and challenges and what we should be thinking about when we're stepping into this?
Yeah, so happy to kind of, I suppose, recount some of the things that we hear from those that engage with us, and I'll draw a little bit from some research that we've just concluded with law firms as well around their kind of use of tech and innovating generally. I think definitely starting small and starting with that kind of low-hanging fruit. So if you are looking to kind of venture into using technology and AI and you want to do it kind of safely, do the quick win so that you can build internally that kind of confidence in the fact that, yes, this is beneficial and this can kind of deliver immediate value. So I think definitely starting with the low-hanging fruit. And then I think the other thing that we regularly hear from kind of many different types of professional is starting with what's the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think we've heard experiences, both good and less good, of firms and teams kind of rushing into using a particular tool or kind of opting for a particular type of technology and then not really kind of delivering what they expected, and then perhaps kind of realizing that actually the problem they were trying to solve wasn't ever going to be totally solved by kind of technology or using AI in a particular way. So I would also say kind of definitely defining your problem as best you can, and kind of going from that is important. And then the third part, which we again kind of hear, is talking to your peers and kind of reaching out to your networks about what others are doing. We run SRA Innovate events twice a year, and I'm always kind of struck about the fact that the people in the room, they just want to know what others are doing, how they've kind of navigated those same challenges, and just kind of get that advice. So I think there's, it's that kind of safe space to ask the stupid questions, isn't it? And kind of being that safe space to talk to your peers about, well, what has your experience been in navigating this ever-changing and evolving market? Because there is, I think, an element of this that is unknowable and will continue to change, and that's okay. And that's kind of a good thing, but it's being able to talk to your peers about that, I think, is another thing that I would recommend.
Brilliant. And so I'm going to use the journey word that I think one of our panelists used earlier, but Harry, you've obviously seen with some of your customers the journey that they've been on in terms of in-house. And is there anything you could share with us just in terms of benefits, or those kind of like aha moments that people have had when they've gone, oh wow, this has really worked in a way that I didn't expect it to?
Yeah, the aha will depend on what piece of tech. Starting with the problem-based methodology is definitely right, because you don't get an aha from a legal contracting tool if what you're trying to solve is a legal research problem, right? So having clear scoping and discovery of what the issues are is going to be primary. But normally it's when something goes wrong and something that typically is the consequence of that doesn't happen because there is a technological guardrail against it is great. So someone leaves, that person has been responsible for handling litigation or whatever it might be. Oh, well, last time that someone left in exactly the same position, it was a nightmare for all these other reasons, but actually because we made this person who's just left follow all these, so they were either tracked using autonomous systems, or they filled in playbooks, or whatever it might be that kept things up to date. The handover was seamless, or as near as could be. Now, those kinds of things have huge advantages, because first of all, we talked a lot about stress in a business and feeling of isolation. There's nothing more isolating than picking up something you've got no context for and have no idea what to do with. And so that is typically where the greatest value is. And sometimes that will be on the upside, where you know that if you have X amount of basic contracts that come through that you don't really care about, but they have to get done in order to get to the higher value work, oh, well, now I know, on average, we talked about data in one of the previous sessions, we know that typically that takes us 20, 30 hours a week, and now that's taking us 5 hours a week. Great, fabulous. Now we can actually do things that the business cares more about to generate value. And I think lawyers are often stuck in this circle of trying to put out fires rather than try and be proactive. And Gen AI in particular has provided lots of opportunities. I think one of the ways that they manage that as well, that I see a lot, is by, and lots of good vendors in tech, not just in legal tech, but broadly, have a very strong partnership-led approach, not just for big businesses. They'll have standardized things that are helpful to new adopters. So, for example, one thing I know Luminance does, but I know lots of other organizations do, is we help them draft their first organization-wide responsible AI policies, generative AI policies. If there's a new piece of tech they want to use wider across the business, a standard questionnaire that anyone in the business can populate in order to have something rapidly approved, a standard register for understanding what's going on in the business, so you also know who's responsible for it if there's a handover. Those are the kinds of things that make adoption easy, but the ahas are normally where either something's really normally goes wrong and doesn't go wrong in the way it did, or there's an upside, but the upside is now tangibly greater.
Wendy, from your perspective, is there anything that you can add there?
I think it's a huge challenge, isn't it, for in-house to understand the amount of tech that's out there. I think vendors that aid that process are super helpful. But I was at an event yesterday that I was astonished by the number of tech booths, vendor booths that there were, how you choose between them. But what's really interesting, I think, is this is quite a collaborative tech sector. The fact that there's things like the VALS report, if you haven't come across that, where people are starting to come together to benchmark the capabilities of some of this technology, is actually a really great way to start to look at technologies and understand, actually they've defined the problem. Do I have the problem? That's absolutely right. Is this a problem for me in my organisation at all? Do I want this tool? And actually, which tech is it out there that I could go and have a look at and that other people have already checked out for me? Because if you've only got so much time and so much money, where are you going to start? So I think those are key challenges for anyone in the tech industry, or in your positions, or in-house or in private practice right now, of how you make those choices.
And anything from an SRA perspective?
I would just echo, I think, kind of that Wendy's point around the challenge in navigating the market is very real for everyone in the sector. We hear it from small-sized firms, we hear it from sole practitioners, kind of from in-house teams, from the bigger firms. There's a huge amount of choice out there. And we're not unique as a sector in that way. I think that's true for other sectors who are experiencing the same kind of tech and AI boom as well. I would say, I think lawyers and our profession are very kind of enabled in asking kind of the questions and in navigating risk. So I think in many ways it's applying what they do elsewhere, due diligence, and kind of asking, the kind of vendors and shopping around and asking the questions that they would already kind of ask. I think my kind of personal observation has been that sometimes with kind of tech and with AI, I think there can be an element of nervousness or just kind of, this is a subject matter that feels kind of new and kind of feel really daunting. And it doesn't have to, kind of bring it back to first principles, bring it back to, what is it that you're trying to solve, why that? And then there's kind of certainly practical examples that we hear from others and from firms in terms of, pilot the software, test it widely, kind of opt for contract lengths that make sense for you and your needs and other things. But I would say that it's a challenge that others are experiencing. And again, that kind of thing, I think, of talking to peers is really helpful in that way as well.
And I think we discussed this on Monday, just this this idea that when you're negotiating the contract,
Yeah.
treat yourself as if you were your client, because I think you'd had an
Yeah.
example where somebody had signed up for a very long contract
Yes,
on terms that just didn't suit them.
Yeah.
And actually there was this sort of moment of, well, why? How did I get myself into this situation, and why did I do that?
Absolutely, yeah. They just had that moment of kind of, I would never have advised a client to kind of sign something this length, but I seem to have found myself in that situation. Which, great they had that realization, perhaps slightly too late, but,
So I think one of the topics that comes up a lot when we're talking about using AI is the question of governance, and sort of what systems you have as a business. Obviously, we have in-house teams within a business, and obviously a team within itself. I just wonder if the panel's got any advice that we can share with our audience today about the types of issues that you should think about. And I'd start with Harry.
Yeah, I mean, I touched on them a little bit in my previous answer. We have very clear full tech stack registers, not just AI, but a clear understanding. We work with our security team and our general tech team to understand every piece of tech that the business is using. We encourage people to be transparent about it because, as I said, undisclosed usage is actually a much greater risk in any event. We have very strict training, and frankly, we're almost threatening. We do everything we can to facilitate you being as tech-enabled as possible. Don't bypass this, because the risk to us as a business is so high. Maintaining our ISO certifications and all the rest is critical. So you can be incredibly detailed and thorough, as is appropriate to the size of your business, and the speed at which you need to move will vary from one to another and how regulated you are. But risk registers is not something that's particularly unusual. Intake forms for new tech that are simplified so that anyone can share that information quickly. We actually have an automated analysis of that form, so if particular pieces of information on there are relatively standardized. So I'm not going to bore everyone with types of IP license, but lots of AI models have a standardized form of license. If it has that, we know it, we're comfortable with it, we don't need to review it automatically, so it actually bypasses legal automatically. All these kinds of things can be done incredibly simply. Now, the reality is you have to have someone who's motivated to do it. So you have to have top-down drive. Now, that's easy for an AI-driven organization. If you're a very large, heavy manufacturing company, with a global presence, it's going to be harder to get buy-in, but maybe you get some more autonomy to do something over there and then test it and scale it as a business. But there are very simple, tangible things that, forget the words Gen AI, that if you were implementing any new system into your business, you would want to reasonably understand where does our IP go, who owns the output, what are the data transfer requirements, the full extensive list that you can go on and on about. It's not that revolutionary. Most existing legal frameworks cover these things, and lawyers are well placed to help build those guardrails for businesses.
Wendy.
Yeah, I think as you're both saying, and if you're designing tech to be used in law, actually all of those questions get asked right up front, and you actually really understand your data. You understand when it's privileged, you understand when it's confidential, you understand the barriers of who's allowed to see this type of information, who's not within an organization outside of it. You understand data protection, you understand all of these things. And as a tech company, I think the way we're looking at it, we're training a model on behavioral science, not on your data. But there will be models that are training on data, and those are questions that you need to ask about what happens and how does the model, the IP of that becomes an interesting challenge. I think actually this is an industry that's really well set in order to be able to ask all the right questions to get people with the right levels of governance at the right moments in time.
Brilliant. So I'm now going to open up to questions from we have one hand up here.
Thanks a lot. My question is for Harry. Harry, I was struck by your title, General Counsel and AI Governance Officer. Do you think that would be the future title for all heads of legal and general counsel in the future? Or are these two distinct roles that at the moment you are fulfilling?
They're completely separate. So AI governance is, in the same way that a DPO is entirely separate. If I have my way, eventually there'll be a separate AI governance officer in our company that is completely distinct. I just happen to be the person with the most interest and sort of relevant experience, because a lot of the frameworks by which AI is governed lean on GDPR, and I spent lots of my career as a privacy lawyer. So no, they're very distinct, and you are seeing a booming market in separated AI governance as a profession. And I think the reason that needs to be separated is because what is necessarily the legal risk is not necessarily always the same as what is the governance risk, like best practice. And governance, I would actually say, includes a broader ethical consideration. Something that we didn't touch on too much is, what if your organization is doing something which is strictly legal, but you may consider to be unethical using AI, whether that's, profiling for employment purposes, insurance metrics, all kinds of different things. Though saying something is technically legal and then having someone else who is looking at it purely within the framework of what is industry norm and acceptable to AI regulators, and there will be their own standalone regulators, in the same way that financial institutions have their GC, but they have a compliance officer who's typically dealing with specific regulation. I think we'll see a complete divestment of those. I think for now, lawyers are just well placed to fill those shoes, and you may see many lawyers transition into that role more full time.
Nicola, there was a lady over there.
Hi. I'm not sure who of you would be best suited to answer this, but it's more of a general future question. So basically, AI models aren't trained on sets of data or algorithmic analysis. And I think, Wendy, you touched on this a bit. You said that if we take the fact that junior lawyers need to be trained and to gain experience in a certain way in order to be able to then have that critical view of where are the limits of the AI technology and when can it be used, when should it be used. So if we take away that menial work away because they use AI, where would it put us as a profession, as ethical partners of the business in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years' time?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think it's a great question, and it's certainly kind of one we hear a lot. And I think the work of lawyers will change, and I think it is already changing. And I think the role of a lawyer in a more AI-enabled world will change. And I also think that will be driven from consumer expectations as well. I personally am really excited about the potential for AI to help consumers be more informed about their legal issues and kind of coming to, kind of to solicitors and to teams with a clearer view on what their options are. And I think that has the opportunity to kind of equalize that relationship a lot more. But I would say that the work will change. I think it will look different, but I think what we know from both our engagements and research that we've done is that people want that human touch and they want that human expertise. So I think it will just be different, but not less lawyers or less solicitors or anything. That's my view on it.
Yeah, and so we look at it from how does expertise develop a lot. And I mean, back in the day, a long time ago, I remember sitting in a room with my fellow trainee as we proofread contracts to each other. Mm-hmm. And you wouldn't want to repeat that now, but what you don't realise we were doing is learning the anatomy of a contract and what interacts with what. And I would definitely not have valued it at the time, but it's embedding it in your experience. Now, there's only so much of that you probably have to do to start to develop expertise, and that's what we know. It's not, do you have to do the same thing 100 times, or actually does experience really and expertise really develop when you see lots of nuanced versions and you start to get challenged? And that's the key, is actually, can you develop greater scaffolds for people so that if this menial work is taken away, menial work in that it can get a bit tedious and boring and we can be bad at it sometimes, there's still what's the value in it that you've lost, and being really careful about that. How do you get the knowledge into somebody's head? Somebody was describing, actually, you get something that can do great document analysis and give you a summary. How does it work when you go and sit down in front of a client if you haven't read it first and got the knowledge in your head as well? How do these two things pair up? And so it's thinking carefully about what is it that lawyers currently do and capturing more of that so that you can support the development of the critical, nuanced understanding of how you then apply it in different scenarios for the future lawyer to continue being at the end. You want the experienced people, and it's as I said again, it's the know-how, which is know what, when, why, who, how. And as we've done interviews with experienced lawyers, one of my colleagues said it's amazing how little law there is in being a lawyer. Because there's a huge amount of, I'm listening to the client, I'm trying to understand exactly what they're trying to get at and where they want to be in a year's time, and I can see all the blockers because I've seen them before in the past, and I'm going to come up with the strategy to be able to deal with that, but they can also adapt to all the things that come up and bite them along the way towards that because they've seen lots of them before. And therefore they can, and that's part of being resilient as well. As we were talking earlier, how do you build up resilience in people? You need to have some experience and exposure to know how to deal with things that come out and blindside you. And I think that's what we need to be careful about as we look at, yes, it's great to get something done super fast, but making sure we don't throw that baby out with the bathwater, and we notice carefully what it is that matters in that and make sure we can take it along the journey with us.
Brilliant. Are there any... Oh, there's somebody with a microphone there.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sneha from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and apologies if my question digresses slightly from applying AI in a company to more regulatory side of things. So we all know that data privacy acts and regulations are more ethics-driven initially because there was access to data and there was requirement to protect data of individuals, and then it became like a highly regulated piece where if you're selling or using or anything that you do in business that requires access to data at any sort of level, it was highly regulated. And obviously we adopted the GDPR as RDPA Act in the UK. So there's a lot of chatter about AI regulations as well. There's EU AI Act, and then there is chatter about how it's also IP-driven, how every information that AI generates needs to be now ethical, cannot infringe IP, and there's expectation that there'll be a lot of discussion or addition to these regulations. I'm kind of inquisitive. It still seems like a gray area personally to me as to how regulated will it be. Do the current data protection regulations cover it all? Do we expect a lot of changes in the next 1 to 2 years?
I don't know who wants to.
I'm happy to
Yep.
on that. The answer is, to my view, that AI regulation in Europe is good, but slightly premature. I mean, if you talk to, I spend a lot of time in the US, you speak to any US companies, the answer is, great, we just simply won't do business there. The addressable risk versus reward isn't worth it for now. We'll wait till we're inevitable. And the same happened, the data privacy example is perfect, because how many people have been on a free website today? I would assume every single person in this room. That is possible because of early misuse of personal data. Every single free website works either on someone subsidizing it or advertising. That works through now what's a much more developed system with carve-outs and all the rest, but broadly through a complex system of advertising based on early misuse, right? It becomes inevitable. That is how internet information is accessed. We live with that. They've built regulations around it for the worst misuses, the largest misuses, the ones with the greatest risk of harm potentially. That's how AI regulation will eventually be applied. Doesn't matter if at the moment there is a huge amount of divergence between the US, EU, UK. China has actually probably the clearest AI regulation, I would say. But eventually, we will see a application of AI regulation, irrespective of what jurisdiction you're in, especially if we're talking over a 20, 30-year window, like I'm talking about personal data, we're talking about the early days of MySpace and Facebook in the early 2000s, that will be applied on the worst offenders, the greatest risks. Really, the great purpose of the AI Act and other AI regulation is to prevent what AI Act considers prohibited AIs, or the highest, and then the highest risk AIs. But broadly, a lot of it will be there in principle, but not really enforced, as we currently see every day with data privacy regulation. Sorry, quite a strong view, but
Brilliant. And I think we've got time for one more question.
Thank you so much. I'm interested in a little bit in the future, but mainly linked to the generation of lawyers coming in, being actually digital natives, and maybe not AI natives, but they're definitely digital first. So I'm interested in how we maintain the kind of personal touch, the kind of human first touch in the law, because obviously that's where the result of law plays out. So for me, I'm interested in how AI will change the law as opposed to accepting that the lawyer's work will change. How will it affect the way the law might change, and how will that affect society at large?
Oh, a big question, a really good question. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts.
That's a great question, and I will not do it justice. I would say, I think like anything, the limiter is going to be human appetite. I feel like we've kind of been here before where kind of technology and there's this huge potential for kind of transformation. And I'm really optimistic about the potential for AI to make things better for consumers and for real life people. I really think it has that opportunity. I think, however, that with some legal issues and some legal problems, they feel so personal, and there is that kind of element of it requiring and people kind of wanting that expert and that reassurance in a human that will remain. I think we just don't know kind of what that will look like as of yet, but I think my view is very much that the role and kind of work of lawyers and solicitors will be different, but I think it will be more important. And I think I'm really interested to see if this huge kind of amount of unmet legal need that we know exists is actually going to start being met, because lawyers will be able to do more of the kind of face-to-face human contact work that people want, rather than the kind of repetitive, time-consuming tasks. So I'm really optimistic, but I'm optimistic in all areas of my life, and it doesn't always serve me well.
I'll add a little bit to that. So I think we've started in litigation, and actually when you're litigating, you have people who have difference of opinion, and actually hand-holding people through to get to a good outcome when you have differences of opinion. And the fact that law is made by interpretation every single day by lawyers, by people. Now, I think tech will help you navigate through, well, what are all the different ways of looking at something? But ultimately, people will be making judgments on what the meaning of something is and how you move forward in different circumstances. Because I think my most used line as an in-house lawyer is, can I do something? It depends. Well, it depends on, and it's the context of all of that. And I think we're a way away from tech that can capture all of the context and understand and interpret what the individual players in your organizations and actually want to achieve, and what the barriers to achieving it are, and how you're going to go through the processes to get there, to get a good outcome within time and money and all the rest of it. So I think there's going to be a human role for lawyers for quite a long time to come yet. I think it will just, we will move towards it, but I think there will continue to be a continuum and an interaction between tech and humans when you're dealing with life-changing and business-changing decisions that are being made.
I think that's a good cliffhanger moment to leave this session. But I'd be really grateful if you could thank all my panel. I think they've been brilliant. Thank you.